This is a presentation of the product OPC Recipe.net, one of 12 product features of the full OPC Systems.net suite. OPC Recipe.net is used to transfer data from databases like SQL Server, Oracle, Access, and mySQL to data sources for OPC servers, OPC clients, or even Visual Studio applications. With OPC Recipe.net, there are 3 recipe types that you can choose from. You can map specific tags to fields in a database table, or you can include in the database table the tag names that you want to write to along with the values that you want to receive from the database. There is confirmation feedback that you can enable to inform the data source that the values have been successfully transferred or if an error has occurred. As a data source, you can use SQL Server, Oracle, Access, and mySQL in an open database format that's easy to query, and we can programmatically or automatically, based upon values from a PLC, specify which data to return from the table in different record sets with a query property. You can modify properties of the recipe configurations during runtime, and you can even do this programmatically from your own Visual Studio application. Each licensed service communicates to unlimited numbers of data sources. You can even use the internet as your communication source. All product features of OPC Systems.net implement .NET remoting. So you can use the internet, a wide area network, or local area network very easily just by using a TCP connection. Let's see how we would set up a recipe execution. You can programmatically set up recipes using the OPC Systems component as demonstrated in the VB.NET example. You can also manually set up the recipe executions using the Configure application under the program group OPC Systems.net. The first thing you would want to do in your recipe configuration is determine what is the data source that you want to write the values to. If you haven't reviewed the data sources video, I would suggest you do this. You can see how you can define data sources to OPC servers, OPC clients, or Visual Studio applications. Select Configure Tags, and we will select the local service to enter in some tags that we're going to write the values to. Select the Add Tag button to add a tag. We'll use the name value01. We'll add 2 more tags, also value02 and value03. From the tag list on the right, we'll select value01 and we'll see the data type is defaulted to a double float, and the data source is set to value. If you want to have the values written to an OPC server, you would set OPC item as the data source and then browse for the OPC item that you want to set the data to. In this way, when a write occurs to an OPC Systems.net tag, the value will go on down to the OPC item defined in the OPC server. Next, we will add a tag to trigger the recipe execution based upon event. Enter the tag name trigger. Select it from the list and set its data type to Boolean, and select Apply Changes. There is also the possibility to provide error feedback and confirmation back to the data source. So let's add 2 more tags so we can see these values. Use the Add Tag button again and enter the tag name error. Select the error tag and set its data type to integer. Click Apply Changes. And the final tag we will add will have the name confirm. Select it from the tag list and set its data type to a Boolean. The confirmation tag will be set to true when the recipe execution completes successfully. If there's an error, that will be false, and the error tag will have a non-zero number in it. We'll then save the tag configuration to a file. We'll use the demo configuration. And now we're ready to set up the recipe execution itself and maps particular tag names to field names. First, we might want to define where is the data coming from. We're going to use Microsoft SQL Server as a data source for the data. I'm going to open up the SQL Server Management Studio. I'm using the free-to-use version of SQL Server Express, which you can download from Microsoft.com. You can also use Microsoft Access, Oracle, or mySQL. I'm going to connect to the database engine. Under the Databases object, I'll right-click to add a new database. I'm going to use a name of Recipe Test and select OK. Then double-click on the Databases object, and there is our new recipe database. Double-click on the Recipe Test database, select the Tables object, and right-click on it to add a new table. Now we need to define the field names that will contain the tag names and the values that we want to receive from the database. The first field I'm going to define, I'm going to use the name tag name. Under the data type, I can use a character type with a length of 100. The second field is where the values are going to come from. For this field name, I'll use the name tag value. And we can set the data type to an integer, Boolean. Here I'm going to use the type float. We can now save that table and give it a name of multiple records. We can now close the design view, double-click on the Tables object, and then select the table Multiple Records. We are now ready to edit the values in that table. We'll right-click on the table and select Open Table. We can now enter into the first column the tag names that we want to write to, and in the second column the values that we want to write. We'll enter in value01.value to write to the value parameter of the value01 tag with the tag value of 1. In the second record, we'll enter in value02.value and enter a value of 2. Tag names are case sensitive, so make sure you use the exact syntax of the tag name and the parameter value as a capital V. We'll enter in the third tag of value03.value and enter in a value in the tag value field of 3. We can then minimize SQL Server Management Studio and go back to the OPC Systems Configure application and now select Configure Recipes. We'll select the local service to configure, enter a recipe name of multiple records. We'll check the box to make the recipe active. Notice that you can set an OPC Systems.net tag to activate the recipe configuration to enable or disable, even based upon an OPC item from an OPC server. Under the recipe type, we can choose multiple records, which is the default. Later in this video, we'll demonstrate how to use both single record and queued records also. Under the execution type, you can choose event-driven, continuous, to execute at a specific interval, or specific time of day to execute at a particular time of the day to execute the recipe. We'll leave the default of event-driven. We can then browse for an OPC Systems.net tag to trigger the recipe execution. We'll select the local service and go down to the trigger tag and select value parameter. When that value transitions from false to true, it will then execute this recipe. We'll also enable confirmation feedback, and we'll assign that to the confirm tag with the value parameter, so that when the recipe successfully executes, that tag value will be set to true. Otherwise, we'll enable the error confirmation and we'll browse for the error tag, and if the recipe execution fails, a numeric value ranging from 1 to 16 will be written to the error tag. In this way, you can have your PLC trigger the recipe execution and then receive feedback with the confirmation tag of being true if successful, or the error tag, which is an integer number, being greater than 0 if there was an error. Let's see how we would use the confirmation and error feedback in a typical PLC request for a recipe execution. The PLC would first set its confirmation bit and error integer to 0. Then the PLC would request the recipe execution by setting the trigger bit from false to true. The PLC would then wait for the confirmation bit to be true if the recipe execution was successful. If the recipe execution fails, the error integer will be set to a non-zero value, and then the PLC can either retry the recipe execution again or report a failure to the operator. Once the recipe execution has completed, the PLC will then set the trigger bit back to false and then repeat the process when the next recipe is needed. We can then specify the timeout. This is the amount of time that we will wait for the values to be set to the desired values from the database. If any of the tags don't match with the desired value, we will wait this full amount of time before failing the recipe execution and indicating that there's a timeout error. The float deadband for floating point signals is the amount in engineering units that's allowable difference to confirm that the values are within the range that they need to be. The recipe execution will not write to the OPC Systems.net tags if the desired value coming from the database matches the existing value of the OPC Systems.net tag. This float deadband property is that allowable range for those floating point signals as long as the OPC Systems.net tag is within the range of the desired tag of this value, then it won't need to write to that OPC Systems.net tag. You can also enable to write to values without feedback, and this way it just writes to the OPC Systems.net tag and does not do any checking to see that the values have been successfully written. This is the fastest way to execute recipes. If you're going to do continuous recipe execution, I would suggest to use this feature to disable feedback checking. Under the Tags tab is where we define the field names in the database to receive the tag names and the values. This is for the multiple record type, and notice that the tag names that we're going to write to are defined in the database table. Later we'll use the single record type and the queued type where we actually map specific tags to specific field names. That's a different table format. Under the Database tab, we'll define what database engine we want to connect to. In this example, we're going to choose SQL Server. What is the server name? That can be obtained from the SQL Server Management Studio. If we go back to there, I'm going to disconnect from the SQL Server engine and then select File, Connect. When the dialog first appears, there is the server name for your database engine. We'll copy and paste that into the server field. The database that we're going to connect to was called Recipe Test, and the table that we're going to receive the data from was multiple records. With SQL Server, we can use Windows authentication or SQL Server authentication. The query string property is used to determine what data is returned from the table. It can be used to filter out all of the values from the table and only return a particular subset. In this first example, we're going to return all the values from the table. We will use this property later when we use the single record type to return specific records from the table. We are now ready to add the recipe configuration to the service with the Add button in the lower left. The recipe is then added to the list in the middle. You can have multiple recipes all running in the same service. We can then save the recipe configuration to a binary file. We'll use the name Recipe Test and click Save. Under Configure Options, is where we would specify to automatically load that recipe configuration when the service starts back up. Then select Apply Changes in the lower right to make that retentive. The recipe is now ready to be executed just by transitioning the trigger tag from false to true. If you don't have a PLC to trigger that tag, you can go back to Configure Tags, select the local service, go to the trigger tag, enter a value of 1 or true, and click Apply Changes. If the execution is successful, you will see then the values 1, 2, and 3 in the value tags of 1, 2, and 3. And in the confirm tag, you will see a true value. In the error tag, we should have 0. You can also build a Visual Studio application with opccontrols.net, as we have demonstrated in the training guide found under the program group opcsystems.net Help. You'll see a training guide. There is a complete section on how to do recipe execution under the bookmark of Chapter 8, Configure Recipes. That's a step-by-step walkthrough of the opcrecipe.net product, as we're doing right now. Let's now change our recipe configuration type from a multiple record type to a single record type. Select the multiple records recipe execution in the middle list and uncheck the recipe active feature and click Apply Changes. Now let's enter in a new recipe name of single record. Check the recipe active checkbox, set the record type to single record. We can leave the execution type as event driven and trigger the execution still based upon the trigger tag. Under the tags column, now we can see that we would map specific opcsystems.net tags to field names. So let's go back to the SQL Server Management Studio and let's define a new table that is record-based. Under the Databases object, double-click on Recipe Test, select the Tables object, right-click on that, and select New Table. In this table format, each value will have its own field name. So we'll enter in a field name of value 01 with the data type of float, value 02 also as a data type of float, and value 03 float. Let's also implement the query string property in the recipe configuration, and we'll enter in another column which is lot number. For the data type, we will choose integer. We can now save this table as single record. We can close the design view, and now we're ready to right-click on that table and open the table. For value 01, we'll enter in a value of 101, value 02, 102, value 03, 103, and the lot number we'll enter in a value of 1. We'll create a second record now of 201, 202, and 203 for the respective value fields, and a lot number of 2. Now let's go back to the Configure application. Under the Configure Recipe section, we're now ready to map those field names of value 01, 02, and 03 to the opcsystems.net tags. select the Add Field button or right-click in the field list and select Add. Select the service that you want to write the opcsystems.net tags to. We're going to select the local service and browse for the tag value01 and select the value parameter. We then enter the field name to map to that opcsystems.net tag, and that needs to be value01 because that's the field name we used in the table. The data type is a double float, and we'll select OK. We'll add two more fields for value02 and value03. Value02 field name and now value03. You can also export all of your field definitions by right-clicking in the field list and selecting CSV Export. You can then use Microsoft Excel to set up all of these tags and fields. Under the Database tab, we want to change the table name from multiple records to single record. We are now going to implement the query string property to return just one record from that table, either for lot 1 or lot 2. To do that, we're going to need to add a new opcsystems.net tag. So let's go to the Configure Tag selection and add a new tag called lot number. Select the lot number tag that was just added and change its data type to an integer. Enter a value of 1 and apply those changes. Now let's add another tag that we're going to use as a calculation, and we'll call that tag name query string. Select the query string tag and set its data type to string. Set the data source to calculation, and now we're going to enter in a calculation that will use the value from the lot number and create a where statement. Choose the Edit button to the right, and in the Calculation dialog, enter this calculation, that is where lot number is equal to the value of the lot number tag. This will allow us to only return the record that matches the specific lot number equal to the current lot number tag. When you click OK, if the syntax is correct, the calculation will be placed into the calculation field. We can then select Apply Changes, and then you will see the value of where lot number equals 1 in the value field itself. We are now ready to use that tag in the recipe configuration for the query string property. Return back to the recipe configuration and click the checkbox that says Set Query String with Tag. Browse for the opcsystems.net tag on the local service with the tag name query string and select the value parameter. Select OK and then click the Add button to add the single record recipe execution to the list of recipe executions. We can then use the Save feature to save the recipes to the configuration file. And now we're ready to run that recipe execution. Return back to Configure Tags and go to the Trigger tag. If the current value is true, set it back to false with Apply Changes, and then set it back to true again. And now under the value fields of 1, 2, and 3, you should have the values 101, 102, and 103 respectively. And now let's go up to the lot number tag, change its value from 1 to 2, click Apply Changes, then return to the Trigger tag and execute the recipe again by setting the value to false and then back to true. We then have under the value tags the values 201, 202, and 203 for each of the value tags. Back under the Common tab of the recipe configuration, one of the other recipe execution types is queued. And when you select queued, it will automatically delete the record that was returned with the query statement when all of the values are successfully sent to the data source. This is a great feature for formulas or batches that need to be scheduled up to run in a particular sequence. The PLC can then trigger the recipe execution. When the values are successfully sent to the PLC, we then get the confirmation down at the PLC that it is successfully transferred, and the record returned from the query statement will be deleted from the table. You can also use direct OPC tags to bypass OPC Systems.net tags and write directly to OPC servers. When browsing a local OPC Systems.net tag, at the top you'll see Direct OPC. You can then browse the OPC servers on the selected node. Keep in mind that could also be on a remote node. We then browse the OPC server. Here we're using the OPC Client.net product to browse the OPC Systems.net OPC server. We can then browse the OPC address space for the tag that we want to write to. Here we're going to take the example of writing to value01.value on the OPC server OPC Systems.net. To transfer values to a Visual Studio application, we have the exact setup that we've just gone through to write to OPC Systems.net tags, and the data source is set to value. Now all we need to do is incorporate the OPC Controls.net product using the OPC Controls data component as demonstrated in the OPC Controls.net training video. If you have any questions about OPC Recipe.net or any of the other OPC Systems.net product features, visit us at opcsystems.com and select the Sales page at the top. There you will find your local representative to assist you.